I have lived long enough to understand that dignity is the last possession a man can hold on to when the world around him decides he is no longer useful. At 76, I wake each morning in the same small house where I once shared my life with my wife, where the voices of my daughter and grandchildren used to echo on Sundays when the family gathered, where the smell of roasted chicken and cinnamon rolls used to fill the air, and where laughter, not silence, was the natural music of the rooms. Now, when I step out of bed, the house greets me with a kind of cautious quiet, as though even the walls are waiting to see whether I will still be able to make it down the hall without losing my balance. My days are simple. I brew my coffee slowly, measuring every spoonful of ground beans with the same precision I once applied to ledgers when I worked as an accountant, and I sit at the kitchen table with the newspaper spread open, pretending to read the headlines while my eyes drift to the photograph of my late wife that hangs on the wall, her smile frozen in time, reminding me of the life I had and lost. It is not loneliness that gnaws at me the most, though loneliness is a heavy thing to carry, heavier even than the grocery bags I drag back from the store once a week. What truly weighs on me is the gradual erosion of respect that comes not from strangers on the street, but from the very people who once depended on me. The daughter who as a child clung to my hand when crossing the street. The son-in-law who looked at me with deferential eyes the day he asked for her hand in marriage. And the grandchildren who once climbed onto my lap and demanded stories of my youth. Time, it seems, turns everything upside down, and the man who was once a provider, a decision-maker, and a source of guidance becomes in their eyes a relic to be humored, tolerated, and finally managed like an old piece of furniture that one does not throw away out of sentiment but no longer truly values. I never thought of myself as fragile, though my knees ache when I climb the stairs and my eyesight blurs when I try to read the fine print on the back of cereal boxes, and I certainly never considered myself weak-minded, though my daughter sometimes tilts her head when I pause in conversation to find the right word, as if she is already rehearsing the day when she will tell others that her father has slipped into forgetfulness. I know my memory is intact, my thoughts are clear, my judgment sharper than many men 20 years younger, but perception often counts for more than truth in family matters, and perception has shifted against me. Still, I try to keep my dignity intact, to appear at family dinners properly dressed, my shirt ironed and my shoes polished, because appearance is a shield, and I want them to see me not as a man sliding into decay, but as one who still commands self-respect. I'm careful not to complain when the portions of food on my plate seem smaller than those on theirs, and I do not comment when conversations drift into territories where my presence is politely ignored, as though my opinions belong to another century. I keep silent because silence is less humiliating than having one's words dismissed. When my daughter invites me for dinner, which she does with an air of duty more than affection, I prepare myself mentally for the role I'm expected to play. The quiet old man at the table, grateful for the seat, smiling at the right moments, nodding when the younger ones speak, refraining from any remark that might sound critical or authoritative, for that is not the role assigned to me anymore. I used to be the man who carved the turkey at Thanksgiving, who poured the wine, who said grace with a voice steady and sure. But now I'm more like a guest who has overstayed his welcome, tolerated out of obligation. Yet inside me there is still the man who worked 45 years, who saved every penny to provide for his family, who paid for his daughter's education, who bought the first car she ever drove, who held her when she cried after her first heartbreak, who took pride in every achievement she had. That man has not vanished. He still breathes beneath the wrinkles and gray hair, beneath the stiff joints and cautious steps. The world may treat me as though I am already half gone, but I am very much here, and I know what respect feels like because I once had it in abundance. The evenings are the hardest, when I sit alone after returning from a family meal, replaying in my mind the subtle dismissals, the condescending smiles, the patronizing tones. I find myself speaking aloud to my wife's photograph, telling her what happened at the table, asking whether she would have tolerated such slights, and imagining her firm, gentle voice reminding me not to let bitterness consume me. I try not to, but bitterness has a way of seeping into the cracks left by repeated humiliations, and each small wound adds to the larger ache of realizing that the people you love most may see you not as you are, but as they choose to see you, and that their choice diminishes you. Still, I go to their table when invited, because family, even when it wounds, is difficult to refuse. I sit down. I hold my knife and fork with steady hands, and I remind myself that dignity is not given. It is maintained, even in silence, even in the face of mockery. Perhaps they do not know the damage they inflict. Perhaps they believe their little jokes are harmless, that their control over what I eat or drink is merely care. But I know the truth. Behind every remark lies a belief that I am fading, and behind every restriction lies an assumption that I am no longer capable of deciding for myself. And I tell myself that one day, perhaps sooner than they think, I will remind them that the man they reduce to a shadow still has a voice, still has pride, and still knows what it means to be respected. The evening that marked the beginning of my unraveling in their eyes seemed at first no different from the others, a regular family dinner at my daughter's house, where the table was set, with all the appearances of warmth and togetherness, though beneath the polished silverware and carefully folded napkins there was always an undercurrent of tension, a sense that I was being tolerated rather than welcomed, placed at the table as one places an old clock on the mantel, not because it is useful, but because throwing it away would seem indecent. I arrived with a bottle of wine I had chosen with some care, a modest Cabernet that I remembered my wife once liked, though I knew full well that my daughter and her husband rarely drank what I brought, preferring instead the expensive labels they considered more appropriate to their social standing. Still, I carried it under my arm like an offering, because that is what it had become, a gesture of gratitude in advance for being included. When I entered, the grandchildren were already at the table, glued to their phones, barely lifting their heads to acknowledge me, muttering quick hellos without warmth. My daughter greeted me with the obligatory kiss on the cheek, her eyes already darting toward the kitchen, checking the roast, the side dishes, the timing, while my son-in-law gave me a nod that was not unfriendly but certainly not affectionate. The nod of a man fulfilling his obligation. I sat where they always placed me, at the far end of the table, not at the head, as once would have been natural, but at the place closest to the wall, convenient for being overlooked. Dinner began with the usual pleasantries, my daughter recounting her week at work, my son-in-law describing some new project at his firm, and the grandchildren interjecting occasionally with a meme or a joke I could not understand. Jokes that left me smiling politely without comprehension, while they exchanged glances that suggested I was hopelessly out of touch. The food was served, roasted vegetables, mashed potatoes, a large platter of steak cut into generous slices, the aroma rich and tempting, and I felt my stomach stir with an appetite that had grown rare in recent years. I reached for the serving fork, intending to take a piece, when the moment arrived that would echo in my memory long after the plates were cleared. My grandson, the older of the two, looked at me with a smirk that seemed too practiced for a boy of 15, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Old men don't deserve meat. It's wasted on them. They should stick to soft food like mashed peas." His words fell on the table like shards of glass, and for a moment I thought, surely someone would correct him, that my daughter would frown, that my son-in-law would tell him to mind his manners, that even his younger sister would look embarrassed. But no such correction came. Instead, my granddaughter giggled, covering her mouth. My son-in-law chuckled as though the boy had said something clever, and my daughter, without looking at me, remarked with that casual tone that wounds more deeply than outright cruelty, "He's just joking, Dad. Don't take it so seriously." I sat frozen, my hand still on the serving fork, the laughter ringing in my ears. The boy leaned back in his chair, triumphant, basking in the approval of his parents, and repeated, "Yeah, why waste steak on someone who won't be around much longer?" The words pierced me deeper than any insult ever had, not because they came from a child. Children repeat what they hear. But because of the silence that followed, the silence of complicity, the silence that told me his words were not merely a joke, not merely the cruelty of youth, but an echo of what his parents themselves believed, and had allowed to seep into their children's mouths. In that moment, I felt a strange mixture of shame and defiance. Shame, because I had been reduced to an object of ridicule at the table where I once carved the meat with authority, where I once was the host, the provider, the one who blessed the meal. Defiance, because I knew I was not the helpless figure they imagined, not the fragile remnant who should be grateful for scraps. With deliberate slowness, I took the fork, speared the largest piece of steak from the platter, and placed it on my plate. The table fell into a momentary hush, as though they had not expected me to answer with action. Then I cut into the meat, savoring the resistance of the knife through the seared flesh, and raised the first bite to my mouth. The taste was rich, full, almost overwhelming, not just because of the flavor, but because of what it represented. A reclaiming of something simple yet vital, the right to eat as I pleased, the right to enjoy the fruits of my labor, the right to exist. At the table, as more than a ghost, I chewed slowly, meeting my grandson's eyes as I swallowed, and I said, not loudly, but with a clarity that cut through the room, "This is the taste of work, of years spent providing, of sacrifices made so that you could sit here and mock me. It is not wasted on me. It belongs to me as much as it belongs to anyone at this table." No one answered. My daughter shifted in her chair, her cheeks flushing, whether from embarrassment or irritation I could not tell. My son-in-law smirked, muttering something about me being dramatic, and my grandson looked away, his bravado momentarily broken. My granddaughter, to my surprise, seemed almost uneasy, her eyes flickering between me and her brother, as though a part of her understood that something cruel had been done. But the moment passed quickly, as moments do when those who should apologize choose instead to dismiss. My daughter cleared her throat, changed the subject to her office politics, and the conversation rolled on, leaving me to sit with my steak, the taste of it mingling with the bitterness in my throat. That night when I returned home, the silence of the house felt heavier than usual. I sat at my kitchen table, the bottle of wine I'd brought still unopened in my bag because they had not bothered to serve it, and I poured myself a glass. Drinking alone, I replayed the words in my mind. Old men don't deserve meat. And I realized that they were not just a child's careless remark. They were the crystallization of a belief that had been growing around me, a belief that my time, my presence, my needs were secondary, expendable, unnecessary. The steak I had eaten was more than food. It was a declaration that I still had the right to claim my place, that I would not be erased so easily, that if I had to fight for dignity with nothing more than a knife and fork, then I would do so. And yet, beneath my defiance, I felt a cold understanding settle into me. This was no isolated moment, no slip of the tongue. It was the beginning of something darker, the first open crack in the facade of family respect. From here, I knew the slights would not lessen but grow, the humiliations would not retreat but advance, and if I did not prepare myself, I would be consumed by them. The boy's words had not merely wounded me, they had awakened me, and once awakened, a man cannot return to sleep. In the days that followed that dinner, the air between my daughter's house and mine seemed to shift in ways so subtle that only someone who had spent decades watching the small tremors of family life could notice them, and I, who had grown accustomed to observing without speaking, felt the shift as clearly as one feels the drop in temperature before a storm. My daughter began to speak of my health in tones that carried both pity and authority, asking questions not to me but around me, as though I were an object in the room, a fragile heirloom to be handled carefully, but not trusted to handle itself. "Dad shouldn't be eating heavy foods anymore," she remarked to her husband one afternoon while I sat within earshot, her words delivered in the same soft, instructive tone she might have used when the children were toddlers and needed guidance on how to hold a spoon. Her husband nodded in agreement, his eyes flicking toward me with the kind of detached calculation one gives to a line item on a budget, and I felt the sting of being discussed rather than addressed. Soon after, when I visited again, I noticed that the portions of food placed on my plate were smaller than the others. At first, I thought it might have been an oversight, but it happened again, and then again, until it was clear that it was deliberate. My steak was replaced with chicken, then with fish, and finally with vegetables alone. And each time I lifted my eyes in silent protest, my daughter would smile that practiced smile of patient kindness and say, "Dad, it's for your own good." Red meat isn't healthy at your age. I wanted to tell her that I had eaten steak all my life, that I had worked 45 years on steak and potatoes and lived to see 76 precisely because I knew the value of nourishment, but the words stuck in my throat, not because I feared speaking, but because I knew they would not be heard. The grandchildren, emboldened by the unspoken approval of their parents, began to mimic these restrictions with cruel little jokes. My grandson would push the bread basket toward me with a grin and say, "Here, Grandpa, you can have the crusts," while my granddaughter, who once clung to my arm with affection, giggled as she asked whether I needed my food mashed. They thought themselves clever, but their cruelty was not of their own invention. It had been planted, watered, and allowed to grow by the silent acquiescence of the adults who should have corrected them. Each jest, each withheld portion, each patronizing remark chipped away at something inside me, not just pride, but a deeper sense of belonging, until I began to feel not like a guest in their home, but like an intruder, tolerated for reasons of blood and obligation, but no longer cherished. One Saturday afternoon, seeking to reclaim some small piece of dignity, I went to the butcher and bought myself a fine cut of steak, thick and marbled, the kind I used to grill in the backyard, while my wife prepared the side dishes, and my daughter ran about barefoot in the grass, her laughter filling the summer air. I carried the steak home with something close to reverence, intending to cook it carefully, to savor it alone in my quiet kitchen as both a meal and a reminder that I still had control over my own table. Yet when I opened the refrigerator the next evening, eager to retrieve it, I found the shelf bare, the package gone. Confused, I searched the drawers and compartments, thinking I might have misplaced it, but it was nowhere. Later that night, when I was invited for dinner at my daughter's house, I saw it, unmistakable on their plates, cut into pieces and served to the children. My grandson gnawed at the edges, his mouth red with juices, while my granddaughter announced proudly that Mom said Grandpa didn't need it. I sat there, silent, the realization crashing over me that even what I bought with my own money, what I had, carried into my own home, was not safe from being taken, appropriated, redistributed according to their judgment. I felt as though I had been stripped not only of food, but of agency, robbed of the simple right to choose what to eat, when to eat, and how to eat. My daughter noticed my silence and said, with that same careful tone she reserved for reprimanding without seeming cruel, "Dad, you should thank us. We're saving you from yourself." I wanted to shout, to pound the table, to demand respect, but instead I chewed the vegetables on my plate with deliberate slowness, because sometimes silence is the only armor a man has left when his words are constantly twisted into proof of his supposed frailty. The escalation did not stop with food. Soon, other decisions were being made for me, small at first, but growing in significance. When I mentioned that I had driven myself to the store, my son-in-law frowned and said, "Maybe it's time to take the keys away, Dad." The roads are dangerous, and your reaction time isn't what it used to be." He said it with the air of a man delivering a fact, not an opinion, and my daughter nodded in agreement. I wanted to tell them that I had driven safely for over 50 years, that I knew the roads of this town better than either of them, that my reflexes were still sharp, but I could see in their eyes that the verdict had already been delivered. At church one Sunday, I overheard my daughter speaking with a neighbor, lowering her voice, but not enough to prevent me from hearing. "He forgets things sometimes," she said, shaking her head with a look of weary martyrdom. "And we're just trying to make sure he's safe." I felt my chest tighten, not from the ache of age, but from the sting of betrayal. Forget things? Yes, I occasionally misplaced my glasses or struggled to recall the name of a neighbor I had not seen in years. But who does not? It was not forgetfulness that threatened me, but the narrative being woven around me, a narrative of decline, of incompetence, of fragility that would justify every restriction they imposed, every freedom they quietly stripped away. At home I found myself increasingly cautious, double-checking the stove after cooking, locking the doors twice at night, not because I doubted myself, but because I knew that any mistake, any slip, any oversight would be seized upon as evidence of my incapacity. I began writing lists for even the simplest tasks, not to remind myself, but to have proof if ever accused. It was a strange existence, living not for myself but for the defense of myself, as though I were on trial in my own family. One evening, after another dinner where my plate was filled with vegetables, while the rest of the table feasted on roast, I returned home and sat in the dark, the bottle of wine I'd brought unopened once again, and I asked my wife's photograph, aloud, when did they stop seeing me as their father and start seeing me as a burden? The silence of the room answered more truthfully than any living voice could. It was not a sudden change, but a slow erosion, years in the making, a steady replacement of respect with calculation, of affection with management, of love with convenience. The steak had been the first theft I could not forgive, not because of the meat itself, but because of what it symbolized, the taking of my choice, my agency, my right to exist as a man who still decided for himself. And I knew then that this was only the beginning. They would not stop. Each week, each dinner, each decision would chip away further, until I was reduced to nothing more than an old man in a chair, waiting to be told what he could or could not do, what he could or could not eat, what he could or could not remember. And I swore to myself, in that dim kitchen with the photograph of my wife watching over me, that I would not go quietly into that fate. The breaking point, if I can call it that, came not with a single word or gesture, but with an accumulation that reached its summit one late afternoon, when I returned from the store carrying a bag with a single treasure, a thick steak wrapped in butcher's paper, a purchase made more for my pride than for my appetite, a private declaration that I still had the right to choose my own food, to taste something more substantial than boiled vegetables or flavorless fish. I placed it in the refrigerator, already imagining how I would season it, how I would set the table with a proper glass of wine, how I would savor it slowly in silence, a solitary ritual that would affirm that my life was still mine to conduct. Yet the following evening, when I opened the fridge with anticipation, the space where the steak had rested was bare, and a hollow kind of dread replaced my hunger. I searched through every drawer, convinced at first that I had misplaced it, but the truth emerged later that day, when I was invited to my daughter's house and saw my grandson with grease on his chin, a plate in front of him that bore the unmistakable traces of what I had bought for myself. My daughter, with that same dismissive patience she always adopted when I questioned anything, said lightly, "Dad, you didn't need that. It was too heavy for you. We thought it better to share it with the kids." The words landed like a final confirmation of what I had already begun to suspect, that nothing in my life was truly my own anymore, not even the food I bought with my own money, not even the small pleasures I carved out for myself. They had not asked, had not even pretended to consult me, but had simply decided, as one decides on behalf of someone who cannot decide for himself. I looked around the table and saw my grandson gnawing with satisfaction, my granddaughter licking the last trace of juice from her fork, my son-in-law pouring himself a glass of wine without offering me any, and my daughter watching it all with a serenity that made it clear she saw nothing wrong, nothing cruel, nothing unjust in what they had done. It was in that moment that something inside me hardened, a clarity sharper than any knife. They were no longer simply dismissing me. They were consuming me, piece by piece, stripping away not only dignity, but ownership of my life. My role at the table had shifted from participant to bystander, from father to dependent, from man to object, and the realization burned through me with such force that for the first time I understood what it meant to be truly invisible while still seated in plain sight. That night, alone in my kitchen, I poured myself a glass of the wine they had ignored, and I sat with the photograph of my wife, speaking aloud in a voice that trembled with anger as much as grief. "They are taking everything, Lavinia," I told her, naming her as though by invoking her presence I might draw strength from the memory of her steadfastness. Not just food, not just money, but me. "They are erasing me, one choice at a time." I stared at her smile in the photograph, the smile of a woman who had believed in me for 40 years, who had leaned on me and trusted me, and I knew that if she were alive, she would never have permitted our daughter to treat me this way. She would have spoken with firmness, reminded them of all that I had given, demanded respect in a way I seemed unable to do. And the absence of her voice made the silence in the room all the more unbearable. The next day, determined to reclaim some measure of control, I withdrew cash from the bank and hid it in an envelope in my closet, a secret reserve that gave me a small sense of power, a reminder that I was not entirely at their mercy. But the illusion of safety cracked when, a week later, my daughter mentioned casually that she had been looking through my cupboards for some vitamins she thought I might need and had noticed the envelope. Her tone was light, almost joking, but I caught the glint in her eye, the unspoken message that nothing I possessed was beyond her reach, nothing too private to be examined, judged, and perhaps taken. It was then that the whispers about nursing homes began, at first dropped into conversation as harmless suggestions. "Dad, wouldn't it be easier if you had people looking after you? You wouldn't have to cook for yourself, wouldn't have to worry about the house." And later spoken more directly, "You can't keep living alone forever. It isn't safe. You'll hurt yourself one day." I understood then what the missing steak and the diminished portions, the casual jokes, and the silent dismissals had all been building toward. They were preparing me not for care, but for dispossession, easing me out of the role of man and father and into the role of ward, a dependent body to be managed and financed, but no longer respected. That night, I made myself another promise as I sat with my glass of wine and the photograph of my wife. I would not allow them to place me where they wanted, would not allow them to strip from me the last remnants of control. I might be old, but I was not weak, not yet broken, and if they thought they could usher me silently into a home, into obscurity, they were mistaken. The theft of that steak was not simply the theft of food. It was a warning, a glimpse into the future they had already planned for me, and it lit in me a resolve fiercer than any I had felt in years. I would not be consumed quietly. If they intended to erase me, they would have to reckon with the fact that I still knew how to fight back. The weeks that followed the theft of my steak felt like walking deeper into a fog where every familiar landmark of my life was slowly erased, and the more I tried to hold on to myself, the more I felt their hands reaching to guide me somewhere I did not want to go, hands that were not gentle but firm with the conviction that they knew better, that I was no longer capable of steering my own existence. What began with smaller humiliations at the dinner table grew into a campaign of decisions made over my head, choices spoken about in my presence as though I were a child, too distracted to understand. My daughter spoke to her husband about me in the third person while I sat beside them, saying things like, "He forgets to turn the stove off sometimes," or "He shouldn't be walking to the store alone, it's too risky." Each phrase was carefully wrapped in the language of concern, but beneath it lay the unmistakable ambition to control, to reduce, to place me in a category where rights and choices dissolve into permissions granted only when convenient. The children mirrored their parents with an ease that both saddened and enraged me. My grandson, emboldened by his earlier triumph, began to treat me not as a grandfather but as a caricature, mocking the slowness of my movements, asking whether I needed help tying my shoes, calling across the room for someone to watch Grandpa so he doesn't spill. His sister, once gentler, now chimed in with her own jabs, telling me I was like a character out of an old movie, someone who spoke with outdated words and wore outdated clothes, and I could see the delight in their faces when their parents did not correct them, when their mockery was met with indulgent smiles or quiet laughter. What hurt most was not the cruelty of youth, because youth can be forgiven for thoughtlessness, but the way my daughter allowed it, as though each insult, each taunt was harmless fun, forgetting that such fun was being carved out of my dignity. It was during one of these dinners that my son-in-law revealed his true hand, though he did so in the polished tone of a man presenting facts rather than opinions. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass of wine, and said to my daughter, "We should talk to the lawyer about power of attorney. If something happens, we'll need access to his accounts. It's only practical." He said this while I sat no more than 3 feet away, my fork poised in the air, frozen by the audacity of being spoken about as though I were not there. I lowered the fork and asked slowly, "Do you mean to take control of my money while I am still alive?" He laughed softly, as though I had misunderstood, and replied, "It's not about taking control, it's about protecting you. You wouldn't want the bank to make things complicated if something happened suddenly, would you?" My daughter nodded, adding, "Dad, it's for your own safety. We don't want to see you cheated or confused." In that instant, I understood more clearly than ever that the jokes, the stolen food, the whispers about my memory were not random slights, but part of a larger picture, a narrative being built brick by brick, one that would portray me as incompetent, unreliable, incapable of decision, until at last they could justify stepping in, not as thieves, but as caretakers, their theft masked as protection. It chilled me to realize how carefully it had all been arranged, how each humiliation was not simply cruelty, but evidence. Small pieces of proof that could be presented if they ever sought legal authority over me. I began to notice details I had previously overlooked, like the way my daughter's eyes lingered on my checkbook when I set it down, or the way my son-in-law asked seemingly casual questions about my pension, my savings, my insurance. They were circling me like vultures, waiting not for death, but for the moment when they could declare me unfit to guard my own nest, swooping in under the banner of responsibility. I realized with growing horror that my own family saw me not as flesh and blood, but as an estate in waiting, an account to be accessed, a property to be managed, and every kindness they offered was poisoned by the suspicion that it was only an investment in their eventual inheritance. The escalation reached its peak one Sunday when, after dinner, my daughter took me aside into the kitchen while her husband entertained the children in the living room. She spoke softly, as though delivering difficult news, telling me that she and her husband had visited a retirement community earlier in the week, a place with a garden, daily activities, nurses on hand 24 hours a day. She described it with an enthusiasm that turned my stomach, as though she were offering me a vacation rather than exile, as though uprooting me from my home, and my life were a gift I should be grateful for. When I remained silent, she placed her hand on my arm and said, "Dad, you can't live alone forever. It isn't safe. What if you fall? What if you forget something important? You'll be surrounded by people your age, people who understand. I pulled my arm away and told her, with a steadiness I did not entirely feel, that I was not ready to be placed anywhere, that I was still capable of managing my own life. Her eyes softened in that maddening way, the look people give to someone they believe is deluded, and she said, "You always say that, but you don't see what we see." That phrase echoed in my mind for days. You don't see what we see. And I realized that this was the crux of their strategy. They were building a vision of me that bore no resemblance to reality, a vision in which I was already fading, already incompetent, already dependent, and they would present this vision as truth until it became the only truth recognized by others. The final straw came when I discovered that my credit card was missing from my wallet. At first, I thought I had misplaced it, but when I called the bank, they told me there had been withdrawals I had not made, amounts large enough to shake me to my core. I did not need to be told who had taken it. I could see it in the nervous glance my daughter gave me the next time we met, in the way my son-in-law avoided my eyes. When I confronted them, they denied nothing, only repeated the same refrain. "It's for your protection." I wanted to shout that theft disguised as protection is still theft, that stripping a man of his agency under the pretense of care is still betrayal, but the words caught in my throat, strangled by the realization that even if I spoke them, they would not be heard. Alone that night, I sat in my darkened house and felt the weight of years pressing down on me, but it was not the weight of age. It was the weight of betrayal. To be mocked by children is one thing, to be dismissed by strangers is another, but to be betrayed by one's own blood, to be stripped of dignity by the very daughter for whom I had labored, sacrificed, and loved, that was a wound deeper than any illness could inflict. I stared at the shadows on the wall and knew with certainty that if I did not act soon, if I did not reclaim myself, I would be swallowed whole, declared incompetent, locked away in some tidy home where my memories would rot alongside me. And in that clarity, born of rage and grief, a plan began to form, not of reconciliation, for I saw then that reconciliation was no longer possible, but of resistance, of defiance, of one final assertion that I was still a man, still capable, still alive. The night of the final dinner arrived with an atmosphere so thick with pretense that even the air in the house seemed strained, every smile rehearsed, every word chosen with calculation, and as I walked through the door, carrying nothing this time, no bottle of wine, no offering, only myself. I felt an unusual calm, the calm of a man who has already made his decision and knows that whatever comes, he will not bend. The table was set extravagantly, more lavishly than usual, with a large platter of steak placed at the center, the meat glistening under the light, the aroma filling the room like an invitation and a test. My daughter greeted me with forced cheer, my son-in-law with the same perfunctory nod, and the grandchildren with smirks that told me they were already primed for another performance of jokes at my expense. But I had no intention of playing their game anymore. We sat down, and conversation unfolded in its usual pattern, my daughter describing some trivial success at work, my son-in-law boasting of a new client, the children chattering about school with one eye on their phones. I listened without speaking, my hands folded on the table, waiting because I knew the moment would come when the ritual of humiliation would unfold, when some cutting remark about my age, my memory, or my frailty would be dropped like a stone into the still water of the evening, rippling out as a laughter around me. And it did. My grandson, his voice brimming with the arrogance of youth, glanced at the platter of steak and said, "We should give Grandpa a salad instead. Meat is wasted on him. He won't be here much longer to enjoy it." There was laughter, soft and knowing. My son-in-law chuckling, my daughter shaking her head in mock scolding, and my granddaughter giggling as though cruelty were merely wit. But I did not smile, did not lower my gaze as I had before. Instead, with deliberate slowness, I reached for the serving fork, speared the thickest piece of steak from the platter, and placed it squarely on my plate. The room went silent for a moment, surprised by my boldness, and then I cut into the meat with steady hands, the knife sliding through the tender flesh, and lifted the first bite to my mouth. I chewed with intention, my eyes fixed on my grandson's, holding his gaze until his smirk faltered. When I swallowed, I set down my fork and spoke, not loudly, but with a clarity that silenced the entire table. "This meat," I said, "is not wasted on me. It is mine by right. I worked for it, earned it, and paid for it with 45 years of my life. Years in which I fed all of you, clothed you, housed you, and gave you every comfort you now take for granted. You sit here and laugh at me. You measure my worth by the number of years I may have lived. But while you lived off my labor, I built the very table at which you now mock me. And let me make one thing clear. I will not sit here any longer and be treated as if I am already gone." My daughter's face reddened, her fork trembling slightly in her hand as she stammered, "Dad, no one is mocking you, it's just—" But I cut her off, my voice sharper than it had been in years. "Do not tell me what I hear with my own ears. Do not dress cruelty in the clothes of a joke. I have endured your dismissals, your theft of my food, your whispers about my memory, your schemes with my money. I know exactly what you are doing, and I'm telling you now, it ends tonight." My son-in-law tried to interject with his smooth tone. "You're misunderstanding. We only want what's best for you." But I turned on him with a glare that made him pause. "What's best for me?" I said, leaning forward, my voice low but trembling with fury. "What was best for me when you took the steak from my refrigerator? When you used my credit card without asking? When you spoke of nursing homes behind my back as though I were already dead? What was best for me when you taught your children that mocking their grandfather was acceptable entertainment? Do not dare speak to me of what's best for me. What you want is convenience. What you want is my money, my house, my obedience, but you will not have them." The silence that followed was heavier than any I had ever felt in that room, the children staring wide-eyed, my daughter's lips pressed tight as though she might cry or explode, and my son-in-law shifting uncomfortably in his chair, his polished facade cracking. And it was then that I revealed what I had kept hidden, the weapon I had prepared in the solitude of my nights. "2 weeks ago," I said evenly, "I went to the lawyer. I changed my will. This house you covet, these savings you circle like vultures, you will never touch them. I left everything to a foundation that will use it for those who need it, for people who will respect what it means to labor a lifetime. You will inherit nothing because you have shown me nothing but contempt." My daughter gasped, her face draining of color, her voice breaking as she cried, "Dad, how could you?" And I answered with a steadiness that felt like justice. "How could I? How could you? How could you, my own child, strip me of dignity, treat me as a burden, laugh while your children mocked me, take what was mine without asking, plan to lock me away in a place where I would wither unseen? You lost your right to ask anything of me the moment you forgot that I am not just your father, but a man, still alive, still deserving of respect." For a long moment, no one moved, the silence broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall, and, in that silence, I felt something within me settle, a release of the weight I'd carried for too long. I picked up my knife and fork again, cut another piece of steak, and ate it slowly, savoring not only the flavor, but the act itself, the simple, defiant act of eating first at a table where I had been relegated to last. I finished my plate without another word, stood, and walked out, leaving behind a family stunned into silence, their laughter finally silenced, not by shame, but by truth. That night, as I sat in my own kitchen once more, pouring myself a glass of wine from the bottle they had never touched, I felt not sorrow, but a strange kind of peace, the peace of a man who has spoken his truth at last, who has drawn the line, who has reclaimed the last piece of himself that no one could take. And I knew then that whatever came next, I would no longer be silent, no longer complicit in my own erasure. I had eaten first, and in that act I declared that I was still here. In the days that followed my outburst at the dinner table, a strange quiet settled over my life. Not the quiet of loneliness, which I had known for many years, but the quiet that comes after a storm has passed and left behind a landscape stripped of illusions. My daughter did not call. My son-in-law did not appear at my door with his practiced smile, and the grandchildren who once filled the house with their restless noise stayed away as though distance itself could erase the words I had spoken. At first, I thought I might feel regret, that I might be consumed by guilt for severing what remained of the fragile bonds between us, but instead I felt an unexpected relief, as though, by speaking the truth aloud, I had finally freed myself from the slow suffocation of silence. I continued my routines much as before, rising early, brewing my coffee, reading the paper at the kitchen table beneath the watchful smile of my wife's photograph. But now each action carried a new weight, not the weight of resignation, but the weight of ownership. The food in my refrigerator was mine again, untouched by hands that claimed to know better, and when I cooked myself a steak one evening, seasoned it as I pleased, and ate it slowly with a glass of wine, I felt more alive than I had in years. Not because of the taste itself, but because no one had told me I should not have it. No one had reached into my life to pluck it away. It was a small victory, perhaps, but it was mine. Of course, there were whispers in town. A neighbor mentioned that my daughter had spoken of me with concern, saying that I was becoming difficult, that I was refusing the help I needed, that age was clouding my judgment. I smiled at the neighbor and let the words pass, because I knew now that I did not have to defend myself against every story spun about me. Let them weave their narrative. I had already written my own ending. The lawyer's papers were signed, the will revised, the accounts secured, and whatever dreams they had of inheritance were gone, replaced by the knowledge that their contempt had cost them everything they once assumed was theirs by birthright. That, too, was mine to give, and mine to take away. In time the anger softened, not into forgiveness, for some wounds do not heal, but into clarity. I no longer asked why they had treated me so, no longer tried to reconcile the child I had raised with the woman who had dismissed me, no longer sought explanations from a world that had chosen convenience over respect. Instead, I turned my attention to what remained: the quiet dignity of living on my own terms, the small joys of independence, the steady companionship of memory. I joined a small group at the senior center, men and women who, like me, had learned that family does not always mean loyalty, who gathered not out of obligation, but out of choice, and in their company I discovered that laughter could return, not the laughter of mockery, but the laughter of equals. When I think back to that night, to the moment when I lifted the steak to my mouth while my grandson's laughter still echoed in the room, I understand now that it was not about the meat at all. It was about a line drawn in the sand, about a declaration that I would not be erased while I still had breath. They wanted me silent, compliant, waiting for the inevitable, but instead I reminded them that I was still a man, and in doing so, I reminded myself as well. That knowledge has carried me since, steadier than any cane, clearer than any prescription. The simple truth that dignity is not granted by others, but claimed for oneself. And so, though I sit often in the same chair by the window, though the days pass with the same rhythm of coffee, paper, and quiet reflection, I do not feel diminished. I feel lighter, freed from the weight of false affection, from the pretense of belonging to those who saw me only as a burden. I have no illusions about the years ahead. I know they are fewer than those behind me. But they are mine, and and that is enough. When I cut into a piece of meat now, I do it with the satisfaction of knowing that it was not withheld, not stolen, not rationed by the hands of others. I eat first, and I eat as a man who remembers, who resists, who remains.